so many people. This annual SDG moment is our opportunity to demonstrate that, as one united family of nations, we have what it takes to eradicate poverty and hunger, tackle climate change, deliver gender equality, and achieve all 17 global goals. And through the Nations United film that will be broadcasted tomorrow, we will bring this message to the entire world. We can make tremendous progress over the coming decade, especially for the most vulnerable and the poorest of the poor. When the public appetite for change is matched with political will and smart policy choices, rapid progress is unstoppable. But our task is daunting. The foundations of our world have been shaken to the core by COVID-19. The pandemic has pushed us towards the worst recession in decades, with terrible consequences for the most vulnerable. Societies and citizens are reeling from widespread disruption. After many years of progress, poverty and hunger are on the rise. Children are suffering from a lack of schooling. Debt is skyrocketing. Fiscal resources are plunging. And even before the virus, inequalities were growing. The benefits of globalization and growth had failed to reach millions upon millions of destitute people, deepening their already profound despair. Biodiversity was also disappearing, and greenhouse gases were at record levels. We need a path that brings health to all, revives economies, brings people in from the margins of society, and builds long-term resilience, sustainability, opportunity, and peace. Excellencies, that path exists. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is designed to address the very fragilities and shortcomings that the pandemic has exposed. And at its heart, there is a simple promise: to end poverty and to leave no one behind. Indeed, the poor have a special claim on our efforts and energies. Those most in need are often those hardest to reach and must be reached first. That means expanding social protection and ensuring universal access to essential services. It means strengthening critical infrastructure like education, health systems, and internet connectivity. And it means placing women at the center of decision-making. The 2030 Agenda also demands a swift and just transition to inclusive, low-carbon, resilient economies. This green transition can deliver more and better jobs and a cleaner environment. It will reduce the risk of future pandemics and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. In short, the 2030 Agenda provides the guiding light we need to end the pandemic, to respond to its socio-economic impacts, and to chart a course for a transformative recovery. Excellencies, public appetite for transformative change is growing. We see it in the leadership of young climate activists and in the global movements for racial justice. We see it in the millions saying no to violence and discrimination against women, no to inequality, no to corruption, and no to political repression. We are also seeing key stakeholders using their power for change. We see it in those who are committed to the global search for a universally accessible vaccine for COVID-19. And we see it in the fact that renewable energy is now more affordable than fossil fuels. More and more businesses are embracing the social, environmental, and financial triple bottom line. Cities and subnational governments are developing new models for how we live, work, and grow food, how we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and how we embrace social diversity. But there is no escaping the fact that one critical ingredient is still missing: political will. Without it, neither public appetite nor stakeholder action will be sufficient. Excellencies, the science is clear. The people are clear. There is no time to procrastinate. The decisions taken over the next few months and years will have enormous impact on where we will be by 2030. 3 areas are particularly crucial: finance, COVID-19 recovery, and ambition. First, financing. Right now, developing countries face the dual challenges of funding the pandemic response and avoiding a major debt crisis. For the Sustainable Development Goals to stand a chance, we must address the immediate, medium, and long-term financing challenges that developing countries face. Our leaders' meeting on financing on 29th of September is an opportunity to get behind the most significant policy options. These include boosting the resources available to international financial institutions and extending the debt service suspension initiative to at least the end of 2021. And this must also entail a broadening of the initiative's scope to all vulnerable, developing and middle-income countries, such as small island developing states, as well as comprehensive debt relief for countries in need. The second priority is inclusive and green COVID-19 recovery plans. Done right, these plans can help countries to transition to a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable economy. As we spend huge amounts of money to recover from the coronavirus, we must deliver new jobs and businesses through a clean, green transition. And that means ensuring that taxpayers' money is used for a resilient, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. It means ending fossil fuel subsidies, making polluters pay for their pollution, and ensuring that no new coal-fired power plants are built. And it means reducing inequalities and placing women, who have been among the worst affected by job losses and increased care burdens, at the center of recovery plans. Women's leadership and equal representation makes institutions and policy decisions more effective and decreases inequalities in outcomes. This has never been more important. The third priority is ambition. We need ambition and solidarity to provide the $35 billion extra needed so that COVID-19 vaccines and treatments are available to everyone fast. Ambition to cut carbon emissions by half in the next decade, paving the way to carbon neutrality by 2050. And ambition to protect biodiversity, achieve gender equality, end poverty and hunger, and fulfill the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals. Excellencies, in the midst of the greatest international crisis of their time, the founders of the United Nations raised their eyes above the horizon and planned a better, safer future. The COVID-19 pandemic, the greatest challenge faced by us since the founding of the United Nations, has brought us low. But we will not be beaten. We too must look beyond the current crisis and set our sights high as we strike out for a world of dignity and opportunity for all on a healthy planet. Together, let us make this a decade of action, a decade of ambition, a decade of transformation, a decade of hope and peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. The blueprint for recovery clearly is very clear. One critical ingredient that is missing: political will. Thank you for that, SG. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to rage in many parts of the world, and without the commitment and courage of frontline workers, nurses, carers, doctors, police, bus drivers, delivery drivers, cleaning staff, farmers, and more, the impacts would be much greater. So at the beginning of the decade of action, when we need to take action by everyone, everywhere, it is important that we take a moment to appreciate those everyday heroes. We will hear now from one of those heroes, Dr. Noah Biran, who was working in Hackensack University Medical Center, New Jersey, among the worst affected regions in the world by COVID-19.
Good morning. Thank you very much. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to speak and to honor those who have died from COVID-19. In late February, I received a call from a physician colleague in northern Italy. He called to beg for ventilators and other respiratory devices. He sounded desperate. He explained that hospitals were running out of both equipment and time. Several weeks later, as I walked through my own hospital's emergency room for the first time since the pandemic hit the New York area, I could hear my Italian friend's voice in my head, and I understood his desperation. Patients were dying around me. People were struggling to breathe, alone in rooms, isolated from loved ones, while staff, fully covered in PPE, were sweating as they worked without food or water from dawn until dusk. In a matter of days, entire hospital systems like my own had to be redesigned. Cafeterias were closed to accommodate intensive care unit beds. Jobs were changed. Gastroenterologists became anesthesiologists. Pediatricians had to take care of elderly patients, and nurses and staff, including those who were pregnant or had underlying medical problems, came to work, sacrificed their own safety for others. With gratitude, we accepted immense and generous support and donations from our community. But what about patients? As an oncologist, I know that cancer does not stop for COVID-19. My patients, often with a weakened immune system, were afraid to come in and receive their treatment. Unfortunately, I still see the ramifications from this pause in care. Many of my patients now have a worse prognosis because their cancer treatment was delayed or their cancer progressed while treatment was paused. Sadly, these outcomes seem to be more pronounced among minorities and those of less means. And as the fight for COVID-19 continues, we grieve with the families whose mother, father, sister, brother, or child have died. COVID-19 has taken over 950,000 lives. The memory of these people will never be forgotten, and their legacy motivates us to keep up the fight. While there is still a long road ahead, we have learned much about the virus, its course, patients at higher risk of morbidity and mortality, and effective therapies. We've proven to be resilient, resourceful, empathic, and to stand for one another in support. These are proving times, and by standing together, we can overcome this crisis. Just as I have seen my patients and colleagues rise to the challenge, I am optimistic that we as a society can do so as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Noah Biran. Our next speaker embodies much of what is needed of the world as we seek to deliver the transformation called for by the Secretary General. In 2013, her life was almost ended because she stood up for girls' rights to education. Her defiance and her resilience inspired the entire world. In 2015, right here in the United Nations, she challenged world leaders to stand up for the rights of people like her and to deliver on the promise of the 2030 Agenda. 5 years later, she is back to deliver the people's address of the 2020 SDG moment. Ms. Malala Yousafzai, the floor is yours.
Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you for inviting me to speak today. When I last spoke here, I was just about to enter university. I was optimistic for what was ahead. University life, making new friends, and access to an incredible education. This June, I graduated in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a reeling world, one many of us could not have predicted. 5 years have passed since the United Nations members agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals. These goals represent the future of millions of people, of girls who want to go to school, of women who fight for their rights, and of young people who fight for a clean air and a safe planet. So far, you have not kept up with your work. So I'd like to know, when are you planning to do the work? When will you commit the necessary funding to give every child 12 years of education? When will you prioritize peace and protect refugees? When will you pass the policies to cut carbon emissions? COVID-19 has been a striking setback to our collective goals. On education alone, 20 million more girls may never be able to go back to their classroom after this crisis ends. Global education funding gap has already increased to $200 billion per year. The pandemic is a setback, but it cannot be an excuse. Our goal should not be to return to the way things were. We need a profound commitment to the way the world should be, a place where every girl can learn and lead, a place where we put people in our planet ahead of profits, a place where leaders keep their promises. I hope you will make commitment, you will act upon them, and you will set the norms of a new era, a sustainable, healthy, educated, and equitable era. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Malala, for your determination to make change happen and for laying down a clear challenge to us all. We will round out this opening segment by hearing from the co-chair of the Secretary-General's SDG advocates who play a key role in advocating for SDG action in the corridors of power and among many stakeholders across the world. I have the honor to introduce a message from Her Excellency Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway, and the co-chair of the Secretary-General's SDG advocates. Madam Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the SDG moment last year, I struck an optimistic tone. My message was that the world is moving forward. The SDGs were gaining traction. We were making progress. Much has happened since then. The COVID-19 pandemic has thrown us all into a crisis of yet unseen proportions. Health systems have been tested, in some cases beyond their limits. Where available, financial resources have been stretched to preserve social and economic infrastructure. And not the least, to help those who have lost jobs and thrown into uncertainty. But in too many places, the resources to save lives and livelihoods are simply not available. A looming debt crisis reminds us of the imbalances and growing inequalities in our world. Indeed, it seems the world is not moving forward. It has rather come to a standstill. The pandemic has exposed fundamental weaknesses in our global system. There can no longer be any doubt about the need for urgent global action to build a fairer and more resilient world. This is exactly what the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is all about. The high-level political forum in July charted the way forward. And allow me to highlight three main points. First, the pandemic strikes indiscriminately. There is no time and place to talk about they and us. Unless the pandemic is addressed as a global challenge, it will bounce back and effectively stop our chances of realizing the SDGs. Second, the development of a vaccine is of paramount importance. Norway is investing heavily in vaccine development and will strive to secure equal access for all. The major economies, the market shapers, the pharmaceutical industries, and the multilateral organizations must all work together towards this goal. And third, to build back better and greener, we need a renewed commitment to an inclusive, innovative, and resilient multilateralism. And as we rebuild from this crisis, we must do so in a manner that gives us a fighting chance when the climate crisis hits. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda with the SDGs sends out a steering call for transformation. Norway will continue to work closely with all of you to make this transformation come true. Thank you.
Thank you to Prime Minister Solberg. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move into a different gear, and if you listen quietly, you'll hear the gears shifting, to provide an Sdg reality check and to set the stage for our work ahead. We are 5 years into the SDGs. So what's the state of play? Are we on track or are we not? How does the situation vary from region to region, country to country? And what do we need to do differently to reach our 2030 destination? We will start with an overview of SDG's progress since 2015 from a global perspective. Each year, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs produces the world's most authoritative report on SDG progress, which takes us through how we are faring on all the goals. In the latest report, we heard loud and clear that the world was not on track to achieve the goals by 2030. Some critical targets were even seeing reversals in progress, and COVID-19 threatens to set us back even further. Understanding data, however, is not easy, especially so when dealing with an agenda as comprehensive and complex as the SDGs. Our next speaker is a data storyteller of world renown. His organization has a very clear purpose: to tackle global misconceptions about global development. And he's here with us today to give us a different perspective on the official data and to help us all understand where we stand on the SDGs as we embark on this decade of action. It is my pleasure now to introduce Mr. Ola Rossling, co-founder and president of the Gapminder Foundation.
Thank you for this honor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a global crisis. But we humans have the exceptional ability to imagine a better world, even during crisis. And we are capable of collaborating globally to turn that imagination into reality. And I'm not saying this just to comfort you in hard times. No, this is true. And the strongest evidence I know is the fact that the United Nations exist. The UN started as an imagination during a crisis, the Second World War. Imagine a future without the Third World War. Very unlikely, said the skeptics. And yet, here we are, 75 years later, and instead of a world war, we have had amazing social progress almost everywhere. The SDGs are also an imagination in a crisis. We used to think of progress as if economy, society, and environment were separate spheres, and that mindset led to the sustainability and exclusion crisis, which we are still in now. In reality, they overlap almost completely, and our mindset is changing. We must improve people's lives while at the same time we protect the environment. That's why we have 17 goals with 169 targets. 35 of them have sufficient up-to-date numbers to track the global progress. Welcome to the global Sdg Race. We lined them up on the start line in 2015. Now, 5 years into the race, they should be here, 1/3 of the distance. Who is winning? Ready, set, go! Let's see, they start moving. Internet is taking off fast, and cell phones, independent human rights institutions, is moving too slow. But inclusive employment is even slower, just like overfishing. But look to the left, slum dwellings is moving the wrong way, just like unsentenced prisoners and biodiversity, while child survival, as usual, looks like a winner. So this is what it looks like right now. 6 of these targets are on track, 24 move too slow or stand still, while 5 are heading the wrong way. Let's take a closer look at some targets through 3 important focus areas: poverty and inequality, gender equality, and climate action. In the first area, extreme poverty rate had been dropping for decades to 10% in 2015, and we agreed to aim for 0. But then the drop didn't continue. Last year's forecast looked bad, and then came Corona. This is the first increase in decades, so action is needed now. Now here's some good news. We have a world record in electrification. The world population grew, but the share with electricity access grew even faster, to 89%. As more poor communities are hooked up to the power grid, it means more poor children can now turn their lamps on at night and study and get better grades and hopefully escape poverty. Many of the targets, as you see, are somehow interconnected. Now, income inequalities. We said we were going to reduce them, but that has not happened. And this may stop the progress in other targets, like maternal health. Here is our second area, gender equality. Another world record here, births attended by trained health staff, 81%. Hooray! But beware, A global average like this often hides enormous inequalities. Let's go back to 2000 and see the huge differences between countries. Bubble sizes show total number of births in each country, and colors show regions. If we spread the countries out by income, GDP per capita, we see that the richest, to the right here, all are high up and close to 100%, while the other countries are on all different levels. That was in 2000. Now we play the world forward, and it's so good to see that most countries move upwards because more deliveries are assisted. But country averages also hide enormous inequalities within the countries. I will show you. But first, we changed the bubble size to show the number of not attended births, basically the size of the problem. And now, I split the population of a country into 10 income groups, with 10% in each. Look, the inequalities within countries are often just as large as the inequalities between countries. The connection here is super strong. Here's a very different gender-related target. Women should have 50% of seats in parliaments. In 2015, we had reached 23%, and we could achieve the goal by just bending the curve up a little. But we didn't do that. If women had equal access to power, that could possibly speed up other targets as well, like putting an end to child marriage or stopping the systematic violence against women, enabling women to decide when they actually wish to become pregnant, or sharing the burden of domestic care work. And maybe even women in power would do more than men to make the climate targets start moving the right way. Who knows? So here is the third area, extremely important, climate action. On the vertical axis, carbon dioxide per person. On the horizontal axis, Human Development Index. Look closely at the left bottom corner. I just started plotting the least developed countries, and the bubble size shows total emissions, and you can hardly see them. And now, countries with higher human development, the pattern is crystal clear. And yet, there are plenty of countries with high human development and quite low emissions per person. This box shows where all countries ultimately should be. The question is, how do we get there? Let's look at electricity again. How much comes from renewable sources? Roughly some 25%. But the good news is, in many countries, renewable are now becoming cheaper than fossil fuels. So it's high time to accelerate a just energy transition now. So, in short, we are moving too slowly to achieve our goals. And I see two big reasons for this. First, we are still not appreciating how much our targets are interconnected, not just within each goal, but across the goals. We need to realize this, the huge overlaps, in order to switch mindset and get out of this global crisis of unsustainability and exclusion. Second, we need reliable data to know who is left out and where to focus our resources, and this is so bad. My favorite target is not moving. This target is to produce enough statistics to track all the other targets. The UN has an SDG database, and this shows how many data points there are per target. Look how it's increasing over the years, and we now have more data than ever before. But a lot is still missing. Many important things are hard to measure, and many of these indicators didn't even have an international standard back in 2015. But since March this year, they all have agreed standards. So now, let's use our imagination and imagine what a success would look like. We gather all the data points we need, and we track all the targets, and imagine we build back better after Corona, and we make all targets reach the goal line in 2030. Now, how strong is your imagination? And how strong is your ability to turn it into reality by collaborating with others? Remember, the future we're imagining here is the future of our children, my children and your children. So we, the people of the world, have really good reasons to take actions and make sure that this particular imagination becomes reality.
I mean, I kind of think that deserves a round of applause, really. We have about 20 people in the room that are refusing to join me. Can we give them a round of applause? I thought that was pretty great. I really loved the analogy of, the World Championship of Nations, or perhaps the Olympics. The question is, which countries are going to win the gold medals and the silver medals and the bronze medals in terms of SDG progress? We are literally, of course, in a race for our lives. Thank you, Ola, for that whirlwind tour of the SDGs, and especially for a reminder that humanity is capable of great progress. Ola provided a global snapshot, but he also called our attention to the data challenge that we must address to have the tools to plan and invest better. To help us to unpack this further, we need to look at the SDGs from a regional perspective. So now we will hear from the executive secretaries of the UN's 5 regional economic and social commissions. They will provide a closer look at progress and challenges across 5 different regions of the world. Like Ola, they will focus on 3 central issues at the core of the SDGs: poverty and inequality, climate change, and gender equality.
In history, there have been moments when catastrophic events wiped out any meaningful progress for the survival of humankind. From Beirut to Bangkok, from Addis Ababa to Santiago, and from Geneva to New York. The COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on all 17 Sustainable Development Goals is imperiling our shared vision to end poverty. The Arab States region is not on track to achieve the SDGs. While a few targets have already been met at the regional level, others are only achievable with structural change.
Before COVID-19, the Arab region had already seen the only increase in extreme poverty globally. The pandemic has pushed an additional 14 million people into poverty, and conflict has left 55 million in need of humanitarian assistance. The region has allocated about $100 billion, but lacks an additional 70 billion in liquidity. Arab countries have adopted the Arab multidimensional poverty framework, but they still need to adopt inclusive social protection systems that are financially sustainable, systems that are catalysts for upward mobility. The Arab region is one of the most unequal in the world. 37 billionaires own as much as bottom half of its adult population. Creating national solidarity funds that connect the wealthiest with the poorest is an innovative policy measure to alleviate poverty and reduce inequality. Shared responsibility is what the region needs.
Asia and the Pacific is not on track to meet most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Progress is slow or stagnant, and in some cases, regressing. With the COVID-19 pandemic, faster progress is needed.
Asia and the Pacific is a development success story. 80% of the extreme poor were lifted out of poverty by 2015. And yet, Asia and the Pacific is still characterized by increasing inequality and high levels of informal labor. 60% of the population is not covered by social protection. 40% have no access to health care. This ingrained inequality has been exacerbated by the pandemic. The unprecedented responses by our countries have opened up the possibility for a different future. Many have raised the level of investment in social protection and healthcare and targeted the segments of society that had been forgotten. Inclusive social protection policies and bringing the furthest behind to the forefront. This is our way forward.
To achieve the targets of the 2030 Agenda, the UN ECE region needs to accelerate progress. While it is on track with eradicating extreme poverty, the pandemic has exacerbated persistent inequalities. Progress has been good with some targets relevant to gender equality, though at the current rate of progress, only 40% of measured targets would be achieved.
Despite some important advances, inequalities remain a major concern for the region. The COVID-19 crisis means redoubling efforts to ensure no one is left behind. 140 million people in the pan-European region still lack access to clean water. I call on all governments to join our protocol on water and health to uphold this basic human right, which is a first line of defense against pandemic. 150 million people in the region cannot afford decent housing. With the UN regional system, UNEC supports countries to close those gaps.
The integrated spirit of the 2030 Agenda is at risk in Latin America and the Caribbean region. While a few SDG targets have already been met at the regional level, Others will only be achievable with strong policy interventions. Available data shows progress in achieving some SDG targets, but sustained efforts are required for others.
Inequality defines Latin America and the Caribbean. Wealth, income, social protection, education, knowledge, and skills are in the hands of the few. Progress made on eradicating poverty have been set back more than a decade in a matter of months. ECLAC estimates a GDP contraction of minus 9.1%, with a rise of poverty up to 231 million and 96 million in extreme poverty. Governments have provided emergency basic income to the poor and tax exemptions and grace periods to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. ECLAC proposes to extend these measures for 9 months. We also propose a basic digital basket comprising a laptop, a smartphone, a tablet, and low-cost connectivity for households without internet. We need a political fiscal compact to ensure universal social protection.
Africa is not on track to meet most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa was not on track to meet any of the targets of SDG 1 to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Of particular concern are the efforts towards achieving SDG 5 on gender equality. More than half of the measured climate targets would not be met unless progress accelerates.
In the last decade, Africa has made progress in reducing poverty. However, 300 million Africans still live below the poverty line. With COVID, 400 million vulnerable Africans may fall into poverty, and that will see us at about 700 million Africans falling into poverty before the end of the crisis. Africa is in its first recession in 25 years. Governments will need to support the process of getting people out of poverty. We will need to do two things. The first, social protection programs. Today on the continent, we spend about $6 billion on social protection programs. We will also need to do job creating programs to ensure that particularly the youth who have fallen into poverty and are more resilient can find jobs for themselves and work their way out of poverty.
While women across Arab countries are making great strides in society and the economy, the region also has the highest level of female unemployment globally and one of the lowest levels of political participation.
Violence against women is on the rise and costs the region an estimated $245 billion. Arab countries should focus more on empowering women economically, continue to do away with social discrimination policies, and create opportunities for them. Embracing technology and creating enabling platforms that support, fund, and scale up businesses powered by women is key. Incentive measures are also needed to link women's small businesses to the region's top businesses through integrated value chains. Investing in women is critical to achieve stable, just, and prosperous Arab societies.
The pandemic risks undoing years of progress in gender equality. Millions of women's jobs in the informal sector have disappeared. Unpaid care work has increased exponentially. Thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises have closed, many of which are run by women.
Rising to the challenge of gender inequality makes the commitment of the Beijing Declaration ever more important. We are witnessing this momentum of change in the Asia-Pacific, lifting their barriers to political participation and leadership, ensuring women's economic empowerment and integration into formal economy, developing gender-responsive and inclusive social protection, and ending violence against women and girls. These are central to our commitments to achieving gender equality in Asia and the Pacific.
For gender equality, the UNEC region has made important strides towards targets on maternal, sexual, and reproductive health. But the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately affected women both at work, where a quarter of women are in precarious jobs, and at home. Violence against women and girls has surged dramatically. Decades of progress on the empowerment of women are at risk. I encourage all stakeholders to join UNEC's efforts to promote the use of gender-specific standards. I call on governments to support women-owned small businesses to drive the recovery we need for the SDGs.
The crisis precipitated by the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on women, who bear the brunt of an excessive burden of unpaid work, increased poverty and job insecurity, limited access to public services, and insufficient financing for gender equality policies.
Women are worse off than men in terms of discrimination, political exclusion, and lack of economic autonomy. Violence against women and girls is the tragedy of inequality exacerbated in these pandemics. The crisis is affecting women more severely as they account for more than 60% of informal labor, and confinement is placing additional pressure as primary caregivers, paid and unpaid. Women are on the front line of the response to the health crisis and are more exposed. They account for 72% of those employed in the health sector. Public care systems are being considered by the region, based on examples of Uruguay and Costa Rica, to open labor options for women. The region has performed well in equal education for women, which in fact reaches tertiary education more broadly than men. However, there is a need to improve their economic autonomy through access to high-quality jobs, equal pay, and financial inclusion.
90% of Africa's women work in the informal sector, and 70% work on cross-border trading or earn their incomes from cross-border trading. To ensure that these women can continue to be prosperous, one is to give them an identity. Informal economies do not generate prosperity. So finding ways of formalizing their businesses and ensuring that they become fully contributing members of society is going to help achieve gender equality. On cross-border trading, the main and most important element, particularly for women businesses, is to ensure, one, that they have access to financing, but secondly, that we can harmonize processes to ensure that when women trade across borders, Africa has 76 borders, that they meet and confront the same kinds of regulatory environments. With the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and the prospect of harmonizing cross-border trading, we hope that we can move further into gender equality on the continent.
Economic growth in Asia and the Pacific has been coupled with increasing vulnerabilities to climate-induced disasters and rising environmental degradation.
When it comes to climate and environment, our region needs acceleration across the board. It means moving towards decarbonization by 2050, a rapid end to fossil fuel subsidies and new investment in coal, tackling air pollution, transforming to green and smart infrastructure and transport, investing in new technology and big data to prepare and respond better to disasters, conserving and protecting our oceans. Part of this transformation have started to take shape. Countries are working on their national roadmap for Sdg 7, increasing the share of renewable energy in their energy mix, switching to the use of clean cooking fuels, strengthening regional cooperation for sustainable oceans. We now look to the SDG moment to set course for the future, one that is inclusive, gender equal, and green.
The Arab region registers the highest temperatures on record, reaching 55 degrees, with 5 more expected by the end of this century. Water and land resources are already strained. Nearly 87 million people lack access to drinking water. The region has already committed to increasing the share of renewable energy in its energy mix and needs to adopt integrated water management policies. However, financing remains the challenge. Exploring new financing means, such as debt for climate swap, is an option. Now is the time to integrate climate action into national planning. People cannot wait, and the planet cannot wait. Accelerating SDG implementation is our way forward.
With its high material footprint, the UNECE region must make its resource use more sustainable. Recovery packages must mobilize investments for the future, fully aligned with the green transformation needed to address climate change.
The region generates some 40% of GDP, but only 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. This shows the region has made some progress towards decarbonizing its economy. The region must further reduce energy use. Buildings' energy needs produce 40% of CO2 emissions. Improving building energy efficiency can deliver massive climate gains and create millions of jobs. Countries must reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and accelerate investment in renewables and low-carbon technologies. As we enter the last 10 years of Agenda 2030, I invite all governments to work with us to make the circular economy a reality.
Our region contributes only with 8.3% of global emissions, yet is highly vulnerable to climate change. Climate action should be the driving force to recover and build back better with job-intensive and carbon-free investments. Our region pledged a collective target of 70% renewable energy by 2030. Investment in renewable energy sources jumped 65%. In Brazil, expansion of wind power mobilized 8.2 million and created 250,000 jobs. Costa Rica, Chile, and Uruguay committed to become carbon neutral in 2050. ECLAC is advocating for debt reduction for resilience in the Caribbean and the creation of a Caribbean resilience for adaptation. In Latin America and the Caribbean, building back better means reshaping development with equality and sustainability.
Over 3 to 5% of Africa's GDP is lost because of climate change. There are two areas where Africa can contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions. The first is agriculture. The second is energy. In agriculture, two policies that we can put in place. The first is reduce extensive agriculture, do more intensive agriculture, but increase productivity, which will increase yields, add an additional $100 billion economy and create 40 million jobs. In energy, Africa today is clearly energy deficient. Over half of our population does not have access to energy. More importantly, industry does not have access to make it competitive and trade globally. Therefore, we will need to produce more energy. Africa has 22,000 megawatts in its national determined contributions. We hope to find financing to do that. That is why Africa is asking for $100 billion to help it get out of the COVID crisis, and special drawing rights to help ensure that we can continue to finance the private sector to ensure that Africa grows back better from the crisis.
Coming out from this pandemic greener will require immense political will. The 2030 Agenda must be our blueprint for our collective action.
Certainly a sobering assessment. The imperatives are really clear, and to reiterate what the narrator there said and the SG said earlier is that we need greater political will. We hope the heads of state and government are watching. If you've just joined us, this is the 2020 SDG Moment. A warm welcome to our viewers from around the world. We now know that from a global perspective, we are moving too slowly to achieve the goals by 2030, and that there are varied but considerable challenges in each and every region. At the same time, our last two presentations also echoed the words of the Secretary General: transformative change is possible. Let's turn now to a presentation about the kind of interventions that are urgently needed to bring about that transformation, based not on theory, but on smart policies and actions that are being advanced by governments and stakeholders around the world. I now have the pleasure to introduce an interactive presentation by the leaders of three key entities of the UN Development System, the administrator of the UN Development Programme, and the executive directors of UN Women and the UN Environment Programme.
A crisis can change the world from one day to the next with tragic consequences. The choices countries make today can lay the foundations for a better future. COVID-19 demonstrates that bold choices and action, which seemed unthinkable before, are possible. We have unique opportunity to transition towards a fair, equitable, and sustainable future. This means tackling poverty and inequality, climate change, and strengthening gender equality, which also sits at the heart of the 2030 Agenda. Inequality is exacerbated by COVID-19. 96 million people are at risk of falling into extreme poverty, widening the gender poverty gap. Critical investments in social protection can help the 4 billion people without access to be more resilient to the effects of the pandemic. Climate change is a threat multiplier, disproportionately affecting the poor. 24.9 million people were forcibly displaced across 140 countries in 2019 because of nearly 1,900 mostly climate-related disasters. They are counting on collective action through Paris Agreement to reverse greenhouse gas emissions. Countries with higher female parliamentary representation are more likely to sign environmental treaties. When women are involved in peace processes, the agreements are more inclusive and durable. But change is too slow. At the current rate of progress, it will take 100 years to close the gender equality gap. Governments and partners have choices that, if correctly combined for the context of each country or group, can translate into a lifelong investment in equality and sustainability. Making those choices starts with commitment to tackling the complexity of human development.
Excellencies, Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General, it's good to be here with you in our UN headquarters, speaking live to the world about this SDG moment. The 2030 Agenda is a universal agenda for humanity, guided by the vision, or as Ola said, our imagination of a sustainable and fair world. But change, as the animation lays out, has been too slow. And now COVID-19 has exposed the implications of tattered safety nets, gender inequalities, and disregard for our planet. The pandemic is a clear warning. Recovery from crisis cannot be driven by a zero-sum game of economy versus environment or health versus economy. Rather, this once-in-a-generation chance to set things straight. And I'm hopeful that this ambition will be met. Over the next 10 minutes, we will tell you a story of what it means to leave no one behind, to put the dignity of every person at the center of building just, sustainable societies and economies. The pandemic is compressing the time it takes to make incredible progress in the face of terrible adversity. And it is shining a light on what has to be done. Together with my dear colleagues Phumzile and Inga, we will explore the courageous choices and policy innovations countries are making right now across the world to tackle the systemic challenges of poverty and inequality, gender inequality, and climate change. Advancing human development means creating opportunities for people through jobs and sustainable economies, but also eradicating the multiple dimensions of poverty and reducing inequality. To achieve this, social protection is an important investment, creating access for everyone to quality basic services, including universal health care. Before COVID, approximately 4 billion, yes, 4 billion people did not have access to social protection. Building people's resilience against vulnerability, risk, and deprivation, and helping them to get on their feet if they falter, defines social protection in the 21st century. This is crucially important given the expected reversal in human development for this year. Consider Colombia. Over the last 20 years, Colombia implemented an integrated social protection system, and it has delivered one of the fastest reductions in multidimensional poverty in the world. When COVID-19 hit, Colombia nearly doubled the number of households receiving social protection benefits in a matter of months. They did so by harnessing the power of digital platforms and modernized financial regulations. The results are expected to mitigate an increase in poverty by almost 5 percentage points. Colombia is not alone in scaling up these innovations. Togo, for example, built a digital cash transfer program from scratch in just 10 days. It now serves 12% of the country's population. Pakistan expanded an existing social protection program by 16 million households, and it now benefits almost half of the country's population. 3 things help drive action on social protection. First, go beyond income, to understand who to target, to know who is suffering most or risks falling into poverty. Second, create fiscal space to invest in social protection. And as UNDP found, a 6-month temporary basic income would require only 1/3 of what developing countries owe in external debt payments just in this year 2020. Creating fiscal space also means phasing out expenditures that no longer make sense, like fossil fuel subsidies, as my colleague Inga will speak to in a moment. And third, make digital the default. The pandemic has shown the power of digital solutions to scale quickly, but also the urgent need to close the digital divide that still affects half the world's population. From expanding social protection to upending gender social norms, as my colleague Phumzile will speak to next, social protection is an opportunity for generational change. Thank you.
Thank you, Akim. This year marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. As we celebrate this landmark agreement, COVID-19 threatens to undo the gains made on gender equality over the past 25 years. Women's economic security is in jeopardy. Gender poverty gaps are widening. Gender-based violence is resurgent, and girls' education and maternal health are threatened. In 2021, it is expected there will be 118 women in poverty for every 100 poor men globally, and this could rise by 2030. This would be a stunning reversal for the SDGs. But this kind of backsliding is not a foregone conclusion. With bold policies to boost women's economic empowerment, we can shift costs and accelerate progress instead, whether it is through policies to increase women's employment, including to support skills development and gender equality in science, technology, and innovation, services to support care to reduce women's load or to respond to violence. Countries recognize women's potential and are showing the way. In 2015, Uruguay put in place a publicly financed comprehensive care system for children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. As a result, Uruguay is today one of the leading countries in childcare provision and employment rates for mothers. There are other examples. Georgia and South Africa are supporting women's businesses. Morocco is assisting women's cooperatives. Japan and Sweden have policies to promote equal pay. In Australia, the government is leading the way to boost women's equality in STEM. The UN system is taking these policy insights to support countries on similar pathways. Societies benefit when women can rise to opportunities. A profound transformation of economies is required for a just, sustainable future where women are at the centers. Countries need to invest in care services, education, and skills that will be a backbone of the economies of the future. My colleague, Inga Anderson, will explore the climate action investments needed to transition from a gray to a green economy.
Thank you, Phumzile, and thank you, Akim. Climate action will help achieve multiple goals across the 2030 agenda. The NDCs are at the very heart of translating climate ambition into action. As we mark 5 years of Agenda 2030, we are contending with the warmest climates on Earth. We cannot afford to be powered by fossil fuels, which are the largest single contributors to climate change. We committed in Paris to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. But projections show that by 2030, we will produce 120% more fossil fuel. This dangerous path could see us double emissions by 2050. As countries construct the response plans, they cannot afford to take their eyes off the relationship between people and planet. As we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. Renewable energy is part of the solution, and we are making progress around the world. South Africa invested $20 billion in renewable energy over the last 8 years. Renewable energy creates jobs. It could create 42 million jobs by 2050, with higher gender parity as compared to traditional energy sectors. And nature's infrastructure holds answers to sustainable, inclusive recovery that drives down poverty and upends gender inequalities. Consider the Sahel. Bordering the Sahara Desert, the Sahel is on the front lines of the climate crisis. The ambitious Great Green Wall, a collaboration from Senegal to Djibouti, contributes to 15 of the 17 SDGs. It's restoring ecosystems, accelerating growth and jobs, and combating climate change. The Secretary General has set out 6 steps for climate action. We need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, redirect finance from nature negative into nature positive flows, invest in renewables. And as we phase out fossil fuels, we need clean and sustainable sources of energy. We need to invest in nature. Excellencies, COVID-19 is a challenge of our lifetimes, but it is also an opportunity to correct conditions that brought us here. A green, inclusive recovery provides a policy space to make long overdue changes to our socioeconomic architecture and to rebalance our relationship with the environment. We must head off the long-term consequences of digital exclusion, including for the millions of children who are left without access to online education. We must offer decent jobs that also protect our natural assets, especially for our young people who will bear the burden or the fruit of the choices that we make today. We must rely on international cooperation and frameworks to steer our paths, and we must do whatever it takes to contain the virus without taking our eyes off the future we want. The world was ill-prepared to confront the devastating effects of COVID-19. We're not here today because of the virus. We're here in spite of it. Our choices matter. This is our decade of transformation.
Thank you to all our presenters of the last segment and for the animators and producers behind the amazing visualizations. We have heard that progress has been made, but we have so much more to do. We have seen the possibilities that lie ahead, and we know that to grasp them, we need to make bold choices. In the next segment, we will hear directly from heads of state and government and the leaders of regional organizations about the gaps they face in their SDG implementation to accelerate progress over the coming decade. To begin, we will hear from the person who presides over the global town hall of our global village and the ultimate home of the 2030 Agenda. I have the great honor to introduce His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the 75th session, the historic 75th session of the UN General Assembly. Mr. President, sir, you have the floor.
His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Ms. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, His Excellency Ambassador Münir Akram, President of ECOSOC. Excellencies, I'm honored to address you all today at this inaugural SDG moment. When mandated by the General Assembly, few of us could have known the setbacks the pandemic would cause the SDGs and the urgency that this would present us today. In less than a year, we have seen social and economic damage on a scale not seen since the Second World War. At least 71 million people are being pushed into extreme poverty. Approximately 270 million people face acute food insecurity. And an estimated 1.6 billion children and youth have seen their education threatened. Allow me to be frank. Progress on the SDGs was inconsistent and, of course, well before COVID-19 shook the world. The pandemic has unveiled the dangers inherent in today. It has reminded us starkly of the need to act. Not since the United Nations was founded has the world required such levels of collaboration, cooperation, and dialogue. These are the moments for which we were built. It is for this reason that I have included the SDGs and Decade of Action amongst the priorities of the 75th session. Halting to the spread of COVID-19 and regaining progress against the SDGs must be our collective priority. Countries in special situations, including the least developed countries, should be prioritized. It will not be easy, but the SDGs themselves provide us the very blueprint needed to recover better. We must look to 2020 with renewed vigor. The pandemic may have set us back, but it can also be the board from which we bounce back further and faster. As countries across the globe embark upon socio-economic recovery plans, let them be guided by the SDGs. Let us choose a more equal, more green, more resilient world. On this, I'm confident that UNDP and the broader UN system, under the guidance of the Deputy Secretary General, are accelerating efforts at the national level. As I open this segment on SDG gaps and plans, I urge heads of state and governments to share the plans and measures to innovate and inspire greater action through transformative pathways over the course of the decade. I support the efforts of the Secretary General in the reform agenda and appreciate the timely and far-reaching reforms of the United Nations development system. UN country teams are key players in this crucial effort and must continue to support national efforts and priorities, particularly around COVID recovery and the SDGs. The Decade of Action may have started with a global emergency and a dramatic setback, but we can choose to let this strengthen our resolve. We can choose to go forward with unwavering ambition to achieve the SDGs while overcoming the COVID-19 pandemic. Let this be the moment that we make the choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good luck as you preside over what will be a historic virtual UN 75 high-level week next week. Regional cooperation between countries has proven to be a critical driver of peace and prosperity over the last 75 years. In this spirit, we will now hear from the leader of the Secretariat of one of the crucial regional organizations, His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission.
Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies, distingués invités. L'année 2020 marque le début de la décennie d'action et de mise en œuvre des objectifs de développement durable lancés par les dirigeants du monde lors de l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies dédiée à cet effet. C'est également le début de la décennie à parcourir avant la fin de l'année butoir des ODD en 2030, soit 3 ans avant l'expiration du premier plan décennal de la mise en œuvre de l'agenda africain, l'agenda 2063. Après 2 décennies de croissance économique soutenue et d'amélioration significative dans le secteur social, le continent était sur la bonne voie pour transformer ses impressionnantes performances économiques afin d'atteindre les niveaux de développement social observés dans d'autres régions du monde. En effet, le continent s'apprêtait à prendre les mesures idoines pour opérationnaliser la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine et accélérer les rythmes de mise en œuvre de l'agenda 2063 et des ODD. Cependant, il vient d'être interrompu dans son élan par l'une des pandémies les plus meurtrières que le monde ait jamais connues. Ce qui a commencé comme une simple crise sanitaire s'est rapidement transformé en l'une des pires crises économiques, sociales et humanitaires et est en train de bouleverser tous les progrès socio-économiques importants réalisés ces dernières années. Dès les premiers instants de l'apparition du virus de la COVID-19 en Afrique, l'Union africaine a créé un fonds de réponse à la COVID-19, initié plusieurs réunions de haut niveau avec le bureau de la conférence des chefs d'État et des communautés économiques régionales, avec les ministres des Finances, de l'Agriculture, de la Santé et de l'Emploi, pour mieux coordonner la stratégie continentale de riposte à la pandémie et les efforts du continent dans la mobilisation des ressources financières. L'Afrique a également mis en place un panel d'envoyés spéciaux pour assister les pays dans la négociation du traitement de la dette publique africaine et la mobilisation des ressources tant au niveau intérieur qu'extérieur. Cependant, ces efforts restent limités compte tenu de l'ampleur des dommages causés par la pandémie. À cet égard, la solidarité mondiale est indispensable, car la pandémie est un défi mondial qui exige que tout le monde travaille ensemble avec un niveau maximum de coopération. C'est une opportunité historique pour rebâtir en mieux les valeurs du multilatéralisme. Pour l'Afrique, la pandémie offre aussi l'occasion de transformer cette crise en une opportunité, en changeant son modèle de développement et en bâtissant des économies plus diversifiées, plus endogènes et plus résilientes vis-à-vis des chocs exogènes. La diversification structurelle des économies à travers la transformation productive, la création de valeur ajoutée aux matières premières et l'utilisation de la digitalisation devrait permettre à l'Afrique de tirer meilleur profit de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, dont la mise en œuvre devrait accroître le commerce intra-africain de 15 à 25% et d'environ 50 à 70 milliards de dollars d'ici 2040. Accélérer la croissance économique et créer de nombreux emplois et opportunités d'épanouissement pour les femmes et les jeunes, ainsi qu'au développement durable. L'Union africaine appelle à plus de solidarité, à plus d'équité, à plus de justice, à plus d'humanité, pour qu'ensemble, nous bâtissons un monde meilleur pour tous. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
I thank the leader of the African Union Commission. Unlike its predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals apply universally because people are being left behind in every country, and because development is a constant process of change and improvement. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we will hear from 23 countries across different regions. What we will see are the unique circumstances, starting points, and contexts in which each country finds itself. But we will also see a range of common and shared regional and global challenges. We will begin with 6 countries from across Africa. We have heard about the trends in poverty reduction, climate, and gender equality in Africa, from slowdown in poverty trends and economic growth to the existential threats of climate change. We will now learn how these trends translate into specific challenges of a group of countries from the region and the plans that these countries have put in place to address them. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government from Angola, Botswana, Nigeria, Seychelles, my country, South Africa, and Morocco.
Excelência, Senhor Secretário-Geral das Nações Unidas, Excelência, Senhor Chefe de Estado e de Governo, minhas senhoras e meus senhores. Saúdo todos os presentes com votos de muito boa saúde, principalmente no momento que o mundo vive uma profunda crise econômica, financeira e social provocada pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola reafirma o seu compromisso de trabalhar pelos 17 Objetivos do Desenvolvimento Sustentável no quadro da Agenda 2030, intitulada Transformar o Nosso Mundo, para que os mesmos sejam alcançados no nosso país, com particular realce para a eliminação da pobreza extrema e a redução significativa dos níveis de pobreza multidimensionais até ao ano 2030. O primeiro objetivo do desenvolvimento sustentável foi definido como sendo a erradicação da pobreza, facto que ganha muito mais importância depois dos fundamentos da economia mundial terem sido fortemente abalados por este forte choque negativo provocado pela pandemia da Covid-19. O governo de Angola atribui uma grande importância às questões relativas ao combate à pobreza e à elevação do bem-estar e da qualidade de vida das populações. Por esta razão, dos 70 programas de ação que integram o Plano de Desenvolvimento Nacional de Angola para o período 2018-2022, 36 têm incidência sobre a meta da eliminação da pobreza extrema e da redução da pobreza multidimensional. Estes programas de combate à pobreza estão definidos com base nos seguintes eixos de atuação: as transferências monetárias, a inclusão produtiva ou geração de trabalho e renda, a ampliação das infraestruturas e da oferta de bens, a ampliação dos serviços sociais com destaque para a alfabetização, o ensino e a saúde, e o reforço da capacidade institucional, sobretudo no domínio da assistência social às crianças, às mulheres, aos jovens e aos idosos. Gostaríamos de destacar o início, a 30 de maio do corrente ano, da implementação de um programa de transferências sociais monetárias que irá abranger 1.600.000 famílias. Este programa, em parceria com o Banco Mundial e que se estenderá até o ano 2022, inclui um pacote financeiro equivalente a 420 milhões de dólares americanos. Numa altura em que, devido a restrições orçamentais e financeiras, a função pública em Angola não está a admitir novos agentes, aumentamos consideravelmente o número de profissionais nos setores da saúde e da educação. Foram abertas mais de 19.000 vagas para professores do ensino geral em 2018 e cerca de 10.000 vagas em 2019, totalizando mais de 29.000 vagas para o sistema de ensino geral só nos últimos 2 anos. No setor da saúde, foram abertas cerca de 7.600 vagas em 2018, enquanto que em 2019 foram abertas 7.000 vagas, prefazendo um total de 14.600 profissionais de saúde. No domínio das infraestruturas para o Sistema Nacional de Saúde, o nosso país fez um importante investimento nos últimos 2 anos, tendo aumentado o número de camas disponíveis nos hospitais em 5.382 unidades. Foram inaugurados novos hospitais em várias localidades do país, aumentando-se assim a oferta dos cuidados intensivos de saúde. Tendo em conta a sua grande importância na economia de Angola, a produção alimentar familiar constitui um pilar de enorme relevância nos esforços do governo de Angola de combate à pobreza.
Mr. President, let me start by echoing Botswana's appreciation for the convening of this high-level event, dubbed the Sdg Moment. We find this initiative opportune as it has great potential to provide sustained impetus for SDGs implementation during this decade of action. Botswana, like many other countries, has been negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which came at a time when my government had just set out a transformative development agenda in line with the 2030 agenda to propel Botswana to greater heights. The unstable global economy has caused disruptions and fiscal constraints that exacerbated the existing national budget deficit. Our worsened fiscal position will curtail efforts geared towards SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. This could ignite negative ripple effects on the country's performance of other SDGs, given the interlinkages. It is indisputable that our ongoing efforts to develop high multiplier effects in job creation run the risk of being reversed by the impact of COVID-19. The small, medium, and micro enterprises are the hardest hit, as they lack the resilience to deal with the effects of the pandemic. Consequently, the purchasing power of households has been eroded, leaving many families looking up to government for assistance. Mr. President, Botswana, with her limited resources, has come up with a short-term COVID-19 economic relief package to support the economy and implement disease containment measures. The package covers interventions such as additional health expenditure, deferment of corporate tax on profit payable by firms, and a loan guarantee scheme to support access to bank credit by affected firms. Moreover, non-fiscal measures adopted include easing the monetary policy and introduction of additional liquidity measures for commercial banks to enable them to support economic activity. Botswana has also developed an economic recovery and transformation plan, which will complement the short-term economic relief package. Mr. President, my government is committed to closing implementation gaps to turn the COVID-19 crisis into a catalyst towards achieving the SDGs. As such, we have collaborated with the UN team in Botswana to develop comprehensive SDGs planning guidelines. The government will also develop an SDG financing strategy and its core institutional components through the design and implementation of an integrated national financing framework. This will strategically position Botswana to identify and leverage domestic and international public and private finance to support the realization of national priorities and SDGs. Botswana intends to collaborate with the international community to apply advanced Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies towards the implementation of her development agenda. Another expected impact is efficiency in spending, cost containment, and avoidance of wastage to effectively deliver public services within the public sector. Mr. President, let me conclude by reaffirming Botswana's commitment and readiness to doing her part towards implementation of our internationally agreed development goals, aimed at leaving no man, woman, or child behind. We thus remain steadfast and determined to build back better and faster. Thank you for your attention.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government and people of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, I congratulate Your Excellency Volkan Bozkır on your election as President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. I would also like to congratulate His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, for convening the maiden edition of the Sustainable Development Goals movement. Nigeria is delighted to be part of this event, which affords us the opportunity as global leaders to reinforce our dedication to achieving the SDGs. I therefore commend the Secretary General for taking steps to place the Decade of Action on SDGs at the center of the crucial high-level week of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Excellencies, Nigeria has made good strides in sustainable development goals, domestication processes, as we have commenced the realignment of the national statistical system with the requirements and indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have developed a novel homegrown integrated Sustainable Development Goals model as an analytical framework for assessing how policy making can better address the indivisible nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. Nigeria has also set up a model private sector advisory group and an SDGs donors forum with a view to engaging critical stakeholders toward the attainment of the SDGs. I wish to recall that Nigeria presented its second voluntary national review on the Sustainable Development Goals to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum in July 2020. The second voluntary national review highlighted our efforts to meet Sustainable Development Goals targets on the critical issues of poverty and an inclusive economy, health and well-being, education and gender equality, enabling environment of peace and security, and partnerships. This was based on our current development priorities as captured in our Economic Recovery and Growth Plan 2017 to 2020, as well as our medium-term National Development Plan 2020 to 2025. Nigeria is also committed to mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals into our subsequent development plans. In this decade of action, Nigeria will implement unique initiatives aimed at accelerating the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Such initiatives include the realigned national statistical system to effectively track and monitor the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals on an annual basis. The Nigeria Integrated Sustainable Development Goals simulation model to support the domestication of the planning model across the 36 states, the integrated national financing frameworks for the Sustainable Development Goals, the scaled-up National Social Investments Program to reach more poor and vulnerable Nigerians in line with our commitment to lift 100 million people out of poverty within a 10-year period, and the engaging of all segments of the society for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Similarly, our National Assembly has established committees on Sustainable Development Goals. The National Youth Service Scheme is also ensuring that Nigerian graduates actively participate in the Sustainable Development Goals implementation processes by serving as SDGs champions at the grassroots. In addition, we have also strengthened our anti-corruption institutions to enable us more effectively combat illicit financial flows and recover its proceeds. Excellencies, in line with our administration's priority, Nigeria inaugurated the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development Task Force team in July 2017. The team was saddled with the responsibility of developing a new framework for measuring officially supported resources for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. However, the coronavirus pandemic has altered our socio-economic dynamics and threatened to derail our progress on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. To address this, we have rededicated efforts towards diversifying our economy, focusing on agriculture and the mining sectors. Having observed that policy incoherence and trade-offs pose significant challenge to us, we will pay greater attention to interlinkages and mainstream sustainability assessment into the annual cycle of our policy planning, as well as budgeting and reporting processes. Going forward, we will invigorate the goal achievement process as a grassroots by engaging the services of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals ambassadors we appointed to support our efforts at the national level. We will also encourage more subnational authorities to appoint and train Sustainable Development Goals champions. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, let me conclude by reaffirming Nigeria's commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and other internationally agreed development goals. You can count on the support of our administration in our collective quest to achieve these noble objectives. Thank you.
Dear honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, this first annual SDG moment is a rallying call for us all. The SDGs unite us around a shared future threatened not only by COVID-19, but by the existential threat of climate change. This shared future is about more than just socio-economic progress. It is about saving lives. Last month, Seychelles celebrated the 250th anniversary of its settlement. Over these 2.5 centuries, a nation has been forged from a melting pot of continents, from the pain of slavery. A nation has been built on the spirit of unity in diversity. This is what Seychelles stands for. A small island developing state, conscious of our isolation, but also aware of our potential, a large ocean nation. Today, the fruits of our labor speak for themselves. The Republic of Seychelles presented its very first voluntary national review in July of this year as its blueprint for SDG implementation. Our successes were notable in areas such as education, health, as well as in environmental protection and conservation. As an island nation, we are inherently vulnerable to external shocks. Climate change underlines this vulnerability, coupled with a narrow resource base and associated challenges of resource mobilization, human resource constraints, and regional maritime security risk. While we have led the way in responding to COVID-19 with no cases of local transmission, the economic impact has been dramatic. For Seychelles, this has meant foregoing some of the hard-fought economic gains and adopting contingency plans focused on protecting our population. This is our foremost priority. I urge all our partners to review criteria currently being used to measure development and ensure that an appropriate focus on vulnerability is captured. The SDGs require us to look beyond GDP. They require us to invest in well-being of citizens. There is no better time in this decade of action to adopt a vulnerability index that can allow us to better target resources for development. The interrelatedness of the SDGs will mean that the COVID-19 pandemic will have systemic effects on our performance in almost all the goals. With an economy heavily reliant on tourism and services, the pandemic has dealt a blow to the livelihoods of thousands. As a global collective, we must also turn to nature to find solutions to the problems we face. In accelerating our economic development, we acknowledge the vast potential of the ocean and the blue economy as catalysts of transformative economic growth through which we all can benefit. We must recognize the true value of our natural capital to fight climate change. Seychelles' decision to protect over 1/3 of its exclusive economic zone is driven by the recognition that we all have a responsibility to solve this problem. In doing so, we will also create new economic opportunities that are anchored in the protection of nature. We need to turn the same urgency of response to COVID-19 to tackle climate change. In the teeth of the crisis created by COVID-19, we are proceeding with remedial policy responses, which will contribute towards bringing Seychelles back on track to achieving the SDGs. In March of this year, the government launched a flagship initiative, the Financial Assistance for Job Retention Scheme, which is catering for the salaries of businesses hardest hit by the adverse effects of COVID-19. A nation such as ours does not have unlimited resources to inject into the response to COVID-19. While we seek to diversify, we do not have a million options to choose from. However, we are determined to protect our people. We are determined to make this decade of action meaningful. Today's reality has put all of us to the test, and in the true Seychellois spirit, the people of Seychelles have risen to the occasion. My fellow SDG champions, despite the threat of the pandemic, we must remain focused on our journey to forge our way towards a brighter, more equitable, and sustainable future. Let us work together with unwavering resolve, leaving no one behind. I thank you.
Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, South Africa welcomes this opportunity to engage on accelerated global action towards sustainable development. As we do so, we face the reality that the immense resources we have directed to fighting the coronavirus pandemic have severely set back our ability to realize the Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, this is an unprecedented opportunity to build back better and fairer. For Africa, the path we must take is clear. The UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a lodestar for transforming our world and the template for global cooperation and partnership. We must invest in our people. We must provide developing countries with the means to achieve the SDGs. We must ensure technology transfer and capacity building support. We must ensure that no country is left behind. We must also prioritize those countries with special needs and circumstances, including least developed countries, small island developing states, and countries in conflict or under occupation. Regrettably, the multilateral response to advancing sustainable development has experienced setbacks on many fronts. This has been in no small part due to the impact of the pandemic. Some countries have reneged on their multilateral commitments. It is our hope that member states will find common course in this ambitious, forward-looking, and truly transformative global agenda. Our experience with COVID-19 has really demonstrated what can be achieved if we act and work together to address global challenges. In the face of the pandemic, African countries have acted with determination and resolve. The African Union is developing a comprehensive response to COVID-19 addressing the economic and social and environmental pillars of sustainable development, working together as countries, as the international community, and with our development partners. It is within our means to meet the aspirations of Agenda 2030. It is within our means to eradicate poverty and inequality and to bring about greater economic justice and conserve our natural world for future generations. I thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السيد الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة، أصحاب السعادة، أتقدم بخالص الشكر للسيد الأمين العام على دعوته لعقد هذا الاجتماع رفيع المستوى حول أهداف التنمية المستدامة، وهو اجتماع ينعقد في وقته المناسب لتقييم التقدم المحرز في تنفيذ تلك الأهداف واستكشاف فرص إعطاء دفعة جديدة لتنفيذها، وهو ضرورة فرضتها جائحة كوفيد-19 التي تسببت في أزمة صحية واقتصادية واجتماعية غير مسبوقة زادت من هشاشة الملايين وجعلت تنفيذ أهداف التنمية المستدامة أكثر صعوبة، لكنها أكدت وجاهة أجندة 2030 وأبرزت مدى حيوية ومركزية الأهداف ذات الصلة بالصحة والحماية الاجتماعية. أصحاب السعادة، لقد جعلت المملكة المغربية من تنفيذ أهداف التنمية المستدامة أولوية وطنية، وقدمت مؤخرا تقريرها الطوعي الثاني أمام المنتدى السياسي رفيع المستوى، وفيه تبين إحراز تقدم ملموس فيما يتعلق بالولوج إلى الخدمات الأساسية ومكافحة الفقر وتقليص الفوارق الاجتماعية وتمكين النساء، بالإضافة إلى الاستثمار في الرأسمال البشري وفي الطاقات المتجددة. لكن كوفيد-19 أثر بشكل كبير على مسار التنمية الاقتصادية والاجتماعية بالمغرب مثل بقية دول العالم، وللحد من تداعيات الجائحة اتخذ المغرب وفقا لتوجيهات جلالة الملك محمد السادس تدابير هامة، أبرزها إحداث صندوق خاص لتدبير آثار الجائحة من خلال تعزيز المنظومة الصحية ودعم الفئات الاجتماعية في وضعية هشاشة ومواكبة المقاولات الأكثر تضرراً. كما تضمن الخطاب الملكي في ذكرى عيد العرش في يوليوز 2020 قرارات إطلاق خطة للإنعاش الاقتصادي يضخ بموجبها ما يعادل 12 مليار دولار في الاقتصاد الوطني، وإنشاء صندوق استثمار استراتيجي لمواكبة القطاعات الإنتاجية والمشاريع الاستثمارية الكبرى وتعميم التغطية الصحية. أصحاب السعادة، تظل المملكة المغربية تحت القيادة الحكيمة لجلالة الملك محمد السادس وفية لالتزاماتها بتعزيز الشراكة الدولية من أجل التنمية، مع جعل إفريقيا في صلبها، وهو ما جسدته المبادرة الملكية التضامنية تجاه حوالي 20 دولة إفريقية في مواجهة كوفيد-19. وأؤكد على ضرورة إيلاء عناية خاصة بإفريقيا لدعمها وتقوية مناعتها في مواجهة الوباء ومواصلة جهودها الرامية لتحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة. كما أجدد دعوة المغرب للأمم المتحدة لإحداث صندوق خاص بدعم تنفيذ تلك الأهداف في إفريقيا، وشكرا على حسن إصغائكم.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government from Angola, Botswana, Nigeria, the Seychelles, South Africa, and Morocco. Next, we will hear from countries in the Asia and Pacific regions. From the megacities and successful development stories to the challenges of small island development states and the complexities of migration and conflict, the next group of countries are searching for a more inclusive and sustainable path and determined to overcome adversities. I invite you to listen now to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Lebanon, Palau, Nepal, and Samoa.
في سبيل على أصحاب السعادة، أتوجه إليكم بالشكر على تنظيم هذا المؤتمر، وهو الأول ضمن خطة العمل على مسار ال10 سنوات القادمة. في سبيل تحقيق الأهداف 17 التنمية المستدامة بحلول العام 2030. هذه الأهداف التي تطمح إليها شعوبنا، والتي يجدد لبنان التزامه بالعمل على تحقيقها رغم الظروف الصعبة التي يمر بها، حتى نصل جميعاً إلى عالم أفضل لنا وللأجيال القادمة. مما لا شك فيه أن عالمنا اليوم يواجه تحديات كبيرة انعكست بشكل مباشر على جميع البلدان، وكان للبنان نصيب كبير منها، وهو الذي تعرض لهزات متلاحقة من أزمة النزوح السوري الكثيف المستمرة منذ 10 أعوام، والتي فرضت علينا واقعاً تنموياً ضاغطاً. وفي خضم مكافحتنا لوباء كوفيد-19 فوجئ لبنان بانفجار مرفأ بيروت الذي ضرب قلب العاصمة وأسفر عن ضحايا بشرية وخسائر مادية كبيرة وآثار سلبية هائلة لن تتسبب في تفاقم الانكماش في النشاط الاقتصادي فحسب، ولكنها ستؤدي أيضاً إلى تعاظم معدلات الفقر. وإذ أغتنمها مناسبة لشكر الدول الشقيقة والصديقة والمؤسسات الدولية التي هبت مشكورة لمؤازرة لبنان وتقديم المساعدات الفورية والإنسانية والمساهمة في لملمة الجراح، فإني ألفت عنايتكم الكريمة إلى أن كل هذه التحديات الضخمة التي يواجهها لبنان قد أثرت على مسار تحديد الأولويات وصارت لزاما علينا. أولاً، العمل على الاستجابة السريعة لمعالجة الأزمات الأكثر إلحاحاً، وذلك من ضمن المبدأ الذي دعت إليه أجندة الأمم المتحدة والمتمثل بعدم ترك أحد في الخلف، أي إيصال المساعدات إلى الفئات الأكثر عوزاً وفقراً وإلى الشرائح المهمشة والمتضررة. ثانياً، إصلاح ما يقارب 200,000 وحدة سكنية لحقها الضرر ومنها دمرت بالكامل، ونتج عن ذلك نزوح 300,000 مواطن، خصوصاً ونحن على أبواب فصل الشتاء. ثالثاً، إعادة إعمار مرفأ بيروت الشريان الحيوي للاقتصاد اللبناني ومعالجة الأضرار الجسيمة التي لحقت بكل القطاعات: الصحة، التعليم، الغذاء، البناء، السياحة. أيها السيدات والسادة، يقف لبنان اليوم على مفترق طريق مصيري بين طموحه لتحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة خلال ال10 القادمة وبين ما يعانيه من أزمات اقتصادية ومالية ونقدية واجتماعية، وهو يحتاج بشكل كبير للمزيد من دعم المجتمع الدولي ومنظمات الأمم المتحدة لمساعدته على تخطي هذه الظروف الطارئة من خلال عمل موجه وتعاون وثيق فيما بينها ومع الجهات الحكومية وبرمجة المساعدات الإنسانية لتأمين الاستقرار الاقتصادي والاجتماعي والدفع باتجاه تحقيق التنمية المستدامة المرجوة لمعالجة مشاكل الحاضر والاستعداد لمتطلبات المستقبل. وشكرا لكم.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, Ali from the Republic of Palau. 7 years ago, Pacific Island states were champions for the inclusion of a stand-alone sustainable development goal on oceans. It was a novel idea at the time and one which encountered substantial resistance. But for our islands and for the world, an agenda which did not recognize the critical role of healthy and resilient oceans to sustainable development could not meet the challenge of our times. The conservation and sustainable use of our marine resources shapes our efforts to end poverty, reduce inequality, and promote human dignity. This is no less true today. Indeed, it is even more important. Turning to the ocean also provides us with solutions for how we can recover development progress lost to this pandemic and how to set us on a new path towards realizing the 2030 agenda. We hear talk of build back better, and this cannot be mere lip service. We need to integrate healthy oceans and climate change into the architecture of development to build back bluer. 4 targets of Code 14 mature this year: on protected areas, on fisheries subsidies, on ecosystem-based management, and on fishing within biological sustainable levels. But as a global community, we are not on track to meet them. Significant gaps in implementation remain. Significant gaps in support for developing countries and island circumstances remain. In Palau, we are making our contribution to the protected areas target through implementing the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, which began just a few months ago. But realizing the full potential of the sanctuary to develop an artisanal domestic fishing sector which supports jobs and improves access to nutritious seafood depends on partnerships, on strengthening existing partnerships and building new ones for technology, finance, and infrastructure. Our moment to draw upon ocean solutions in setting course for the decade of action is now. We hope that the Palau Sanctuary provides inspiration for biodiversity negotiations to set the minimal level of ocean ambition through a commitment to protect 30% of our ocean by 2030. And that it also provides inspiration for 100% of the ocean to be sustainably managed. In December, the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy of 14 leaders will launch our recommendations for a transition towards a sustainable ocean economy. This will point to transformative actions that respond to the threats that the ocean faces, so that the ocean can support our sustainable development. As our decade of action begins, we must not leave the ocean behind. Only by doing this can we ensure that our people are not left behind. Kong Malmusulang, thank you very much.
Excellencies, the heads of state and government, UN Secretary General Mr. Antonio Guterres, distinguished delegates. At the outset, I would like to commend the Secretary General for convening this high-level event. We are meeting at a critical juncture. The COVID-19 pandemic has devastated livelihoods, disrupted economies, and distressed the public health and social security systems. Most importantly, as we embark on the decade of action and delivery of the 2030 agenda, the pandemic has derailed the momentum of its implementation. The challenges have compounded and gaps have widened. However, this is not a moment to shift the goalpost further, nor is it a time to back off in despair. To navigate these turbulent times, the SDGs must serve as the compass of clarity. Excellencies, sustainable development is at the center of Nepal's development vision and priorities. It underpins our national aspiration of prosperous Nepal, happy Nepali. We have mainstreamed the SDGs into the national plans and programs. They are now being localized. Showcasing our progress in SDGs, we presented our second voluntary national review report in high-level political forum in July this year. We have made some significant achievements in key areas including poverty reduction, food security, education, gender equality, basic sanitation, and energy access. Our people have been enjoying fundamental rights and freedoms as enshrined in the Constitution. However, the challenges and gaps remain. The current health crisis threatens our hard-earned gains, pushing our plan to graduate from the LDC status in peril. This COVID-19 pandemic has affected the countries in a special situation such as LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDs disproportionately. Their freezing economy, shrinking revenue, increasing public expenditure, rising poverty, and unemployment have severe impact in the attainment of the SDGs. We welcome the global initiatives and support measures taken in response to COVID-19. But this is not enough. Aligning these support measures with the 2030 Agenda, Istanbul Programme of Action, Vienna Programme of Action, Addis Agenda, and the Paris Agreement is equally important. For this, there is an urgent need to accelerate action at all levels and by all stakeholders beyond rhetoric. Our message should be of a cautious hope to steer the decade of action as well as recovery with sustainability as its core. In conclusion, a renewed sense of urgency and accountability in our collective efforts is critical to build back better and to ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda and its 17 goals is our whole of society plan of action to propel the work on a path towards a sustainable and resilient future. 5 years after their adoption, the implementation of the interrelated goals is more critical and demands more ambitious and accelerated action if we are to end poverty, survive pandemic, fight inequality, or reverse the existential threat posed by climate change. Samoa applauds the SDG Moment Initiative and is pleased to be amongst the inaugural group of countries to launch the Decade of Action. Our commitment to the 2030 Agenda is underscored by our inclusion in the first group of countries to report on our progress on SDGs in 2016 with our second VNR presented in July this year. Overall, our reviews revealed both positive gains and some regressions in some targets. We have integrated the SDGs and other global priorities into our national development planning, both medium and long-term budgeting partnership arrangements, accountability processes, and in alignment with regional planning as well. Data collection and inclusive and effective shareholder engagement was improved. We are pleased with the progress made in linking SDG implementation efforts with our regional and international commitments, including the Paris Agreement, Samoa Pathway, the Pacific Framework for Regionalism, the Human Rights Disarmament, and Environmental Conventions. The linkages are essential to building on synergies and identifying the gaps for better prioritization of accelerated action and transformative pathway. For implementation, Nevertheless, we face persistent challenges of limited resources, administrative capacity, skills gaps in data analysis and management. Samoa supports member countries' requests to the multilateral system to consider all possible ways to lessen physical debt distressant, ensure enhanced resilience. The biggest challenge for Samoa is our increased vulnerability to external shocks, disasters, and emerging threats, such as health crisis. We are experiencing loss of hard-fought gains due to the 2019 measles epidemic and the ongoing COVID-19 situation. Samoa's ability to develop a strategic response will determine the achievement of many of the SDGs. We are using our second VNR findings to feed into our new 5-year strategy for development, inform the Samoa 2040 vision and our COVID-19 response. It will also feed into the implementation processes for our human rights treaties. Finally, government will continue to ensure strong and decisive leadership and strengthen our whole of society approach, including through job creation, well-funded education, and protection to women and girls. These are key to our decade of action to improve the quality of life for all by leaving no one behind. So forth.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government of Lebanon, Palau, Samoa, Nepal, for their intervention. And of course, if you've just joined us from where you're watching around the world, this is the 2020 SDG moment. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Next, we move to countries in the Eastern Europe group to have a closer look at the texture at a country level of gender equalities, effective institutions, and broadening opportunities for younger populations. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Georgia, North Macedonia, Slovenia, and Bulgaria.
Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, the world is facing unprecedented threats in this year marking the United Nations 75th anniversary. The pandemic has affected every country on the globe, causing health, social, and economic breakdowns and exposing most the vulnerable and high-risk groups. Global, state, and local response to the COVID-19 pandemic varies in intensity, but the one direction that can unite our efforts in achieving stable progress remains more than ever the implementation of the SDGs. Hence, today's moment is a very timely initiative by the Secretary General in order to share and reconfirm our commitments. Georgia has managed one of the most successful responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Timely measures proved to be effective, and we have been learning as we go along to adapt our measures and the society's response. This initial success has been possible because the entire country stood together. Citizens, government, parliament, health systems, civil society, political parties, and all international development partners. In accordance with the first goal of the SDGs, we have set as a priority to minimize the social and economic impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable and high-risk groups by providing support packages. To leave no one behind has remained and remains our top priority. The speed, flexibility, and generosity of our development partners have supported us to adapt rapidly to the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Georgia has been privileged to be among the first recipients of resources from the Secretary General's UN COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund. Georgia has 4 strategic priorities: security, economic development and employment, education and human capital, and open governance remain in the core of our daily work, and we have twice already presented our voluntary national review for achieving the SDGs. A new 2021-2025 cooperation framework will be signed between Georgia and the UN family, focusing on one overarching priority: enhancing human well-being, capabilities, and social equality. Now is the time for the next steps, that we need to show that sustainable development provides equal opportunities and helps countries to move forward with a more sustainable, inclusive, gender-equal society and a green and resilient economy to protect hard-won progress. SDG 17, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development, needs to remain at the center of our mobilization. Without an understanding that today's challenges are global and that the way out is through international cooperation and solidarity, we will not emerge stronger from this crisis. It is impossible for any single country to address alone the global pandemic. Even though the challenges we face may be huge, we shall overcome them by working together and by delivering for all. Thank you.
Distinguished Excellencies, I would like to thank the UN Secretary General for organizing this annual SDG moment. It is an honor to be part of this debate, which comes at a very important yet uncertain time. The COVID-19 pandemic has had severe impact, not only on the economy, it has also changed our lives and habits beyond recognition. Nowadays, the need to focus on sustainable development is even more urgent, yet this complex task requires coordinated reforms and profound shift in how we design our societies. In 2015, we pledged to leave no one behind and agreed to implement the 2030 Agenda as adopted by UN member states. Our focus is on better life for all citizens, and our national efforts on sustainable development are also in line with our key foreign policy goal, joining the European Union. The rapid integration assessment of the SDGs conducted in 2019 found that 83% of national strategic development plans were aligned with the SDGs. Priority goals for 2019-2020 for North Macedonia are to end poverty, to provide inclusive and equitable quality education, to promote inclusive and sustainable economic growth and decent jobs for all, to take urgent actions to combat climate change, to ensure access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Climate change remains a challenge. At the Paris Summit in December 2015, the government committed to reducing emissions from fossil fuels by as much as 36% by 2030, compared with the baseline scenario. We have taken measures to produce clean, affordable, and secure energy, including increased use of solar energy. Air pollution remains a challenge for North Macedonia, and it requires long-term, systemic approach, investing in greener economy for greener environment. Equality before the law is a priority for us. We are committed to continue with structural reforms, strengthen the rule of law and judicial system that would be trusted by the majority of the citizens. In July 2020, we presented the first voluntary national review, which reflects on the achievements on the Agenda 2030 and identifies next steps to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs in the remaining decade of action. In drafting this document, we partnered with and are grateful for the contribution to the UN agencies in North Macedonia, youth organizations, civil society, academia, and chambers of commerce. Sustainable development is not just an additional plan for the world. The Agenda 2030 is an obligation to ours and future generations to fully utilize the human potential and consider the legacy we will leave behind. Thank you for your attention.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Agenda offers a better future for billions of people around the world and for our planet as a whole. Slovenia was one of the first countries to incorporate sustainable development goals in the frame of its national priorities. We are committed to a transparent implementation of the agenda. That is why we presented voluntary national review already for the second time. I am happy to report that Slovenia has made progress in almost all of the 17 goals, in particular with regard to ending poverty in all its forms everywhere. Significant improvement has been made also in other areas, such as recycling and eco-farming. Slovenia ranks as a high-performing education system. Still, there are challenges ahead of us in the areas of labor market, circular economy, and climate neutrality. Slovenia, as we see it in 2030, is a green country of clean nature and many natural habitats. It is a society of knowledge, innovation, new technologies, with a high level of wealth and comfort. We believe that by working together for the sustainable transformation of Slovenia, we can make a key contribution to co-creating a better and fairer world. The so-called new normality caused by a pandemic of COVID-19 is bringing about major political, economic, and social changes. Its impact will be more powerful than the direct healthcare consequences. The COVID lesson is one of unity and solidarity. The pandemic has also forced us to become more creative, to think differently, to seek solutions where we have not before. The goals of Agenda 2030, although adopted in different eras, is an accurate answer to challenges of our time. Today, we have 10 years in front of the finish line. There is no time to waste. The moment is now. Thank you so much.
Уважаеми господин генерален секретар, Ваши превъзходителства, дами и господа. Дневният ред 2300 е особено важен за България като ключ за справяне с бедността и неравенствата и начин за постигането на проспериращо, мирно и приобщаващо общество. Още през 2015 година поехме дългосрочен ангажимент към всички 17 цели за устойчиво развитие. Остават ни само 10 години за изпълнението им и е необходима пълна мобилизация на международната общност. Пандемията COVID-19 показа, че има сериозно изоставане в изпълнението на целите. На преден план излязоха изострените социални неравенства, бедността, сериозните последствия от промените на климата. Същевременно, пандемията COVID-19 ясно показа, че дневният ред 2030 година е по-важен от всякога. Обявеното десетилетие на действието ще бъде и десетилетие на възстановяването. Това е шанс за по-добро възстановяване с фокус върху изпълнението на целите за устойчиво развитие. Пандемията COVID-19 ни научи, че нито една държава не може да се справи сама. Необходими са тясно сътрудничество и координирани действия. Същевременно всички ние трябва да изпълним своя дял от ангажиментите си при стриктно спазване на принципа никой да не бъде изоставен. И участието на всички заинтересовани страни, ангажираността на неправителствения сектор, бизнеса, младежите, академичните среди, уязвимите групи и местното управление е ключовото за постигане на целите. Тази година България представи първия си доброволен национален преглед. Наред с постиженията, идентифицирахме и някои предизвикателства пред изпълнението на нашия дял от ангажиментите си. Необходимо е подобряване на качеството на образованието и здравеопазването. Бедността и социалното изключване продължават да представляват предизвикателство. Необходимо е и надежно прилагане на законодателството за опазване на природата. Планираме да изградим национален механизъм за координация на изпълнението на целите за устойчиво развитие с участието на правителството и широк кръг заинтересовани страни. Мотото на българския парламент "Съединението прави силата" е напълно валидно и по отношение на изпълнението на целите за устойчиво развитие. България е готова да изпълни своята част. Време е за действие.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government of Georgia, North Macedonia, Slovenia, and Bulgaria. Persistent inequalities and increasing poverty are among the challenges that Latin America was facing before COVID-19. For the Caribbean small island developing states, issues of debt and the impacts of climate change represent topics of utmost concern. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Barbados.
De cara al año 2030, Colombia se comprometió a cumplir los 17 objetivos para alcanzar un desarrollo sostenible, ordenado y que tenga como propósito derrotar la pobreza extrema en todo el planeta. Nuestro plan de desarrollo, Pacto por Colombia, Pacto por la Equidad, tiene el objetivo de derrotar desigualdades y enfocar a nuestro país para la construcción sostenible de la equidad. Desafortunadamente, la pandemia llegó a todos los países para quedarse por un largo tiempo y pese a la proyección de disminución del 9.1% del PIB de la región latinoamericana, nos propusimos actuar con celeridad. Para reducir las desigualdades y erradicar la pobreza, el gobierno ha llevado ayuda financiera a más de 10 millones de familias y ha asignado recursos correspondientes al 11% del PIB nacional. Por esto, hemos implementado y fortalecido medidas sociales como el programa Familias en Acción, Jóvenes en Acción y Ayuda al Adulto Mayor. Asimismo, por primera vez en la historia del país, creamos un programa de ayuda económica dirigido a 3 millones de colombianos en condición de vulnerabilidad que no contaban con ningún subsidio por parte del Estado. Ya son 1.300.000 colombianos que tienen acceso al agua potable y saneamiento básico por primera vez. Adicionalmente, durante la pandemia, conectamos el servicio público de agua a más de 300.000 hogares que no contaban con este servicio. Estamos comprometidos con fortalecer el sistema de salud y por eso duplicamos el número de camas de cuidado intensivo en tiempo récord. Hoy los colombianos cuentan con más de 10.000 camas y 6.000 ventiladores nuevos en todo el territorio nacional, un crecimiento del 91% en la capacidad y una inversión de 2.200 millones de dólares. Durante este tiempo de dificultades, hemos avanzado en conectividad y también en transformación digital en todo el territorio nacional. Implementamos atención médica por medios tecnológicos, logramos hasta el momento 33 millones de atenciones. También hemos llegado a 10.000 centros poblados rurales con internet gratis las 24 horas y así garantizaremos que todos los estudiantes tengan acceso a la educación por medios digitales y que el aislamiento físico no sea un impedimento para estudiar. Estamos comprometidos con la lucha contra el cambio climático, la protección de la biodiversidad y de los páramos. Hemos sembrado 35 millones de árboles nativos en todo el territorio nacional. Asimismo, la consolidación de la política de paz con legalidad, que genera desarrollo y estabilización para los 170 municipios más afectados históricamente por la violencia y por la pobreza en el país, ha sido una de nuestras prioridades. El objetivo de Colombia, en los últimos años y particularmente en esta década de acción y resultados a favor del desarrollo sostenible, ha sido cerrar las brechas sociales con una política social basada en el crecimiento económico sostenido, la erradicación de la pobreza, la cobertura universal y con calidad en educación, el acceso a servicios públicos y la igualdad de género. Colombia sigue mirando hacia el futuro, comprometida, porque sabemos que como nación construir equidad es construir una paz sostenible y con legalidad.
Excelencias, señores y señoras, aplaudo la iniciativa de hacer esta reunión anual para lograr el mayor anhelo de la humanidad: paz, prosperidad y el bienestar de millones de hermanos en el mundo. Nuestro deber es impulsar la plena implementación de la Agenda 2030 y tener un planeta más sano. En este sentido, mi gobierno ejecuta el Plan Nacional de Desarrollo 2017-2021 que hemos denominado Toda una Vida, que en sus años de gestión ha obtenido importantes reconocimientos a nivel internacional. Su nombre lo dice todo. Protegemos al ser humano desde el momento de su concepción hasta que Dios decida cerrarnos los ojos. Toda una vida, toda la vida. Mi país ha presentado en 2 ocasiones su examen nacional de carácter voluntario. Voy a mencionar algunos indicadores. Por ejemplo, la brecha de ingreso laboral entre hombres y mujeres se redujo en más de 8 puntos porcentuales hasta 2019. La mortalidad materna por cada 100.000 nacidos vivos bajó 8 puntos hasta el 2018. El servicio de saneamiento aumentó 5 puntos. Se incrementó de 70 a 75.000 el número de personas con discapacidad que han sido incluidas en el sistema laboral. El acceso a vivienda aumentó en 2 puntos y el uso de Internet creció en 10 puntos porcentuales. Obtuvimos recursos por $1.800 millones para enfrentar el COVID-19. Fijamos los límites al gasto y estamos entregando créditos de reactivación productiva. Además, 950.000 familias recibieron un bono de protección emergente, por mencionar entre estas solo algunas de las medidas que implementamos en un tiempo récord. Sin embargo, todo será insuficiente sin la solidaridad, principalmente la solidaridad internacional. Hoy defendemos el multilateralismo y la cooperación para avanzar hacia la cobertura universal de salud y la igualdad de acceso a medicamentos y vacunas contra el COVID-19. Ecuador está listo para combatir los efectos del cambio climático, proteger la biodiversidad, defender la conservación del medio marino y el uso sostenible de océanos y mares. También para evitar la desertificación y la sequía, porque el progreso económico, social y tecnológico debe estar siempre en relación armónica con la naturaleza. Excelencias, señoras y señores, en este aniversario 75 de la ONU, Ecuador renueva su compromiso con la Agenda 2030, sustentada en el multilateralismo, en la cooperación internacional y en el principio de responsabilidades comunes, sí, pero diferenciadas. Eso incluye la movilización de recursos financieros, el fortalecimiento de capacidades y la transferencia de desarrollo de tecnología entre todos los países miembros. Que este aniversario que hoy celebramos sirva para reforzar nuestras convicciones y nos motive a luchar a favor de un mundo mejor. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, señor presidente. En primer lugar, quiero saludarlos a la distancia y enviarles el afecto y el cariño del pueblo peruano. Estamos viviendo días cruciales en el planeta, cuyos efectos alcanzan a la economía, el empleo, la educación, el comercio y la mayoría de actividades humanas. Pero miramos con optimismo el futuro y nuestro compromiso de continuar con los esfuerzos para ganar esta batalla contra el virus. La celebración del 75 aniversario de creación de las Naciones Unidas y el inicio de la década de acción a favor del desarrollo sostenible nos encuentra enfrentando la más devastadora crisis de la pandemia del COVID-19, pero al mismo tiempo enfocados en el cumplimiento de la Agenda 2030 y los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible como la hoja de ruta que debe guiar nuestras decisiones a nivel nacional e internacional. La naturaleza de la pandemia, que afecta a casi todo el mundo, exige respuestas globales, apoyadas en un sistema multilateral fortalecido y eficiente. Al respecto, el Perú considera esencial que a través de las Naciones Unidas hagamos efectivo el enunciado de que las vacunas y los tratamientos contra el COVID-19 sean considerados como bienes públicos globales. Estamos seguros que ello contribuirá a que esta competencia por el conocimiento, que involucra a investigadores, académicos, gobiernos, industria farmacéutica, filántropos y voluntarios, logre resultados que nos traigan un beneficio colectivo. Obtener el acceso universal, oportuno y equitativo de las vacunas está en línea con el compromiso de la Agenda 2030 de no dejar a nadie atrás y llegar primero a los más rezagados. La COVID-19 y sus efectos ha hecho aún más evidentes las desigualdades, no solo sanitarias, sino socioeconómicas en muchas de nuestras sociedades, así como también la fragilidad de los avances que se venían alcanzando. Esta temática nos recuerda que al adoptar la Agenda 2030 nos comprometimos a transformar nuestro mundo y para promover firmemente esa transformación, en mi país hemos propuesto un acuerdo, un pacto entre la sociedad peruana y su Estado en la visión del Perú al 2050. Esta aspiración transformadora orientó las medidas que adoptamos, no solo para mitigar los impactos de la pandemia, sino también para cerrar las brechas sociales. El plan de reactivación económica y social, uno de los más ambiciosos en la historia del Perú, representa un impulso equivalente al 20% del Producto Bruto Interno, que se traduce en el fortalecimiento de los servicios de salud, bonos económicos para las familias pobres y vulnerables, facilidades para que pequeños productores y empresas puedan continuar sus actividades, programas de educación a distancia, entre otros componentes. Asimismo, hemos convocado al Pacto Perú en el marco del Acuerdo Nacional y definimos trabajar 5 aspectos. El primero, la construcción de un sistema unificado de salud. El segundo, garantizar la calidad educativa. El tercero, promover el crecimiento económico. El cuarto, reforma del sistema de administración de justicia. Y el quinto, y no menos importante, lucha contra la pobreza y la pobreza extrema. El pacto servirá de base para el Plan de Desarrollo Nacional que anuncié en la Cumbre de los Objetivos del Desarrollo Sostenible en septiembre del año pasado. Finalmente, corresponderá a quien me suceda como resultado de las elecciones generales convocadas para abril del 2021, en cumplimiento del calendario electoral y el mandato constitucional, seguir avanzando de manera concertada en el cumplimiento de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible que ha asumido el Perú. Muchas gracias.
Excelencia, me encuentro aquí en Caracas, Venezuela, de pie, como presidente constitucional de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Junto a nuestro pueblo, un pueblo heroico que resiste y vence las más diversas agresiones del imperio más poderoso que haya conocido la humanidad. Estamos en este año 2020, sin duda, en el desarrollo de lo que es una segunda gesta de independencia, en defensa de nuestra soberanía, de nuestros recursos naturales y de nuestro derecho al desarrollo. Una gesta heroica de un país entero que, a pesar de las dificultades y agresiones, está hoy en ofensiva para cumplir la Agenda 2030. Los Estados Unidos y su gobierno han pretendido sin éxito erosionar por medio de criminales medidas coercitivas unilaterales nuestra base de la seguridad social y tratar de hacer colapsar el modelo de inclusión y de justicia que hemos construido. La revolución bolivariana ha avanzado en el transcurso de 2 décadas en la consolidación de un sistema de protección y seguridad social a través de las llamadas misiones y grandes misiones sociales, parte esencial de la estructura del ingreso familiar para la vida y protección, que a pesar de los desafíos que impone actualmente la pandemia del COVID-19 y de los bloqueos económicos y financieros, se mantiene y se consolida. Por ejemplo, los llamados CLAP tienen una cobertura de más de 6 millones de familias para la protección alimentaria permanente en un país de 30 millones de habitantes. La misión Vivienda Venezuela, que ha construido en los últimos años y entregado más de 3 millones de viviendas dignas y cómodas, respetando el concepto del hábitat y de la comunidad. Las misiones que tienen que ver con la protección de los pensionados, pensionadas, que han llegado a casi 5 millones de pensionados. Igualmente las misiones educativas y todo lo que tiene que ver con el cumplimiento de los antiguos objetivos del milenio en el campo educativo. Los programas de atención escolar que llegan a más de 6 millones de niños. La entrega de los textos escolares y el financiamiento permanente de la educación pública. En el caso de la pandemia del COVID-19, gracias a las inversiones hechas en los últimos 20 años, hemos logrado darle atención al 99% de la población contagiada del COVID-19, garantizando atención médica y todo el cuerpo de medicina gratuito para el pueblo de Venezuela en el sistema de salud pública venezolano. Nosotros ratificamos ante el sistema de Naciones Unidas nuestro compromiso programático para el cumplimiento de la Agenda 2030 y la protección integral de nuestro pueblo en todos los aspectos de su desarrollo sostenible. No habrá agresión imperial, bloqueo, sanciones que detenga el rumbo de Venezuela hacia la justicia social, hacia el desarrollo sustentable y hacia la felicidad de todos, como lo soñara nuestro comandante Hugo Chávez y como lo esbozara nuestro libertador Simón Bolívar. Muchas gracias.
An SDG moment, what is it? We have set out as small island states to want to pursue development goals which really reflect the SDGs. That is why we have no difficulty in joining the rest of the world in agreeing that we should reach the SDG goals by 2030. For they are truly our development goals. And when many of our countries became independent, these were the things that we wanted to do, to fight against poverty, to fight against hunger, to be able to provide education and healthcare for our people. And when we add all of the other things along the way in fighting inequality and in being able to ensure that we have good water and good sanitation, and we come now to the reality of the 21st century where we've had to include climate because that represents the biggest obstacle in terms of our long-run development that can literally throw us back down to pauperization as middle-income countries. I trust and pray that the world will come together recognizing that these development goals are true and real, not just for countries, but for our citizens, for our people. And when we consider that many of the developing countries in the world, at the time of independence, at the time of the settlement of their affairs, were not given the financial arrangements or access to financing that would allow them to be able to provide for their people as quickly as they would have liked, then we have a duty today to correct those wrongs. Some people call it reparations. We just call it trying to stay the path on the development trajectory and to recognize that out of our existence, out of our development, before we became independent, much was extracted, but not much was left for us to finance our own development. If we want the SDG 2030 agenda to be real, then we need to settle the issue of financing for development. Do our people have the desire to have and to bring development to themselves? Of course we do. But do we have the funding? No, we don't. Do we have the policy space that will trigger growth at an even faster rate? We don't have it, because often criteria and definitions are used to hobble us, not to empower us. So in closing, I'd like to cite Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "It is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his bootstraps." Developing countries, for the most part, as we came out of colonialism, were not given a settlement to allow us to lift ourselves by our bootstraps. Indeed, many instances, we didn't have boots. I trust and pray that in this, the third decade of the 21st century, we will do right, not just by developing countries, but by all people across this globe. With you, Barbados and the Caribbean stand in this noble objective. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and Barbados. Our final set of countries today fall into the high-income category bracket, and the Western European and other group. Yes, these countries are also hugely challenged on a range of issues, not least the reduction of emissions and action to ensure gender equality and social cohesion. I invite you now to listen to the statements from the distinguished heads of state and government of Austria and Finland.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, greetings from Vienna, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in Austria. The Austrian government presented our first voluntary national review this year. This review is the outcome of an inclusive process involving not only our national and regional governments, but a variety of stakeholders, academia, businesses, sub-regional authorities, NGOs, and many enthusiastic individuals. We believe that this multi-pronged approach is essential in aiming to transform our world as the SDGs do. At the heart of Austria's national review lies SDG number 13, climate action. Austria has set itself several ambitious goals in this regard. A massive expansion of renewable, non-nuclear energy sources by 2030, phasing out fossil fuels and achieving climate neutrality by 2040. Still, we are aware that none of us can do that alone. Only together can we tackle the climate crisis. Europe, as the richest continent, is required to lead this fight by making the strongest efforts. This is why the European Union has committed to make our continent climate neutral by 2050. At the heart of that effort lies our European growth strategy after the COVID-19 pandemic, the European Green Deal. And we will upgrade our level of ambition further. Instead of a reduction of CO2 emissions by 40% by 2030, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced this week that we want to reduce them by 55%. The details will have to be agreed in European legislation, but the direction of travel is clear. There is no time to lose. For the climate crisis, there is no vaccine, no quick fix. We ourselves and our actions are the vaccination. Thank you again for the opportunity. Stay healthy and see you next year in New York.
Madam Deputy Secretary General, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies. We are in the middle of a global crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The crisis has also brought challenges to many of the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to the ones focusing on health and poverty, I would like to stress the importance of gender equality. When our societies face turmoil, the rights of women and girls, particularly sexual and reproductive health and rights, are often eroded. We need to be decisive in safeguarding these rights. In order to build a sustainable future, we need the full contribution of women and girls too. Ladies and gentlemen, the current crisis also brings us an opportunity we can't afford to miss. Across the world, we see governments and institutions responding to it with enormous financial stimulus packages. We must make sure that these funds are used cleverly in order to truly build back better and greener. Our recovery now needs to align with the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Excellencies, achieving the SDGs by 2030 is not possible without adequate financing. Nationally, therefore, Finland will continue to integrate sustainable development into our state budget. Our aim is to have the 2030 Agenda forming the basis for all government policies. We are determined to transform Finland into a socially economically and ecologically sustainable society during this decade. And globally, together with our co-chair Chile, Finland is actively engaging the coalition of finance ministers for climate action, now with over 50 members. While managing the ongoing pandemic, we also need to strengthen global resilience to future shocks. We can't achieve it without global cooperation. We can't achieve it without a strong rules-based multilateral system. And we can't achieve it without the Sustainable Development Goals.
I thank the distinguished heads of state and government of Austria and Finland and all the heads of state and government that joined us for their inputs from around the world. Over the last hour, we have heard statements from a diverse range of countries highlighting their efforts, their challenges, their gaps, and their plans. In the final segment of our SDG moment today, we will hear from a number of stakeholders who are already making a strong contribution to SDG implementation and who have some of the tools and resources needed to support governments to address their gaps and drive the transition to inclusive and sustainable development. We will begin with the discussion I held earlier this week with two of the Secretary General's SDG advocates, young people who don't just represent hope for the future, they embody the power of young people today and incredible capacities of those in vulnerable or minority groups. Take a listen and a watch. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be joined here by two of the Secretary General's SDG advocates, Eddie Ndopu from South Africa and Hindu Omaru Ibrahim from Chad. Both of you are tireless champions, Eddie for those with disabilities and Hindu for indigenous peoples and climate change. But you both use your voices and influence for those who are consistently left behind and consider the SDGs to be the roadmap for building a better world where no one is left behind. For those watching today, can you both give us a quick taste of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected communities that you are from? Hindu first, and then Eddie.
Thank you. More than 20,000 in Amazon and many others around the world dead. Indigenous community living in the remote areas, they are impacted by the lack of information, lack of accessing clean water even to drink, so they can't have a soap to wash them hands 4 times a day. And when the market are closed, so they can't exchange them product and is creating food insecurity, economy destroyed and increasing poverty. We are suffering from the health perspective, but from also the consequences of socioeconomic of this crisis.
Eddie?
Well, the truth of the matter is that people with disabilities around the world have been made to disappear from public view. And we are bearing witness to the disappearance of people with disabilities from the discourse around COVID-19. The fact that we use coded language like underlying conditions without explicitly naming people with disabilities is indicative of the disappearance of disabled people. So not only are we fighting for our lives in terms of our health, we are fighting to be incorporated into the global discourse, not just of what a recovery looks like, but who's really being impacted. People with disabilities around the globe live in institutionalized settings, within care homes, and the sheer magnitude of our experience is completely rendered invisible in the context of the discourse around COVID.
So for those in government and the leaders watching, the message you want to send is that the same communities who are already the furthest behind keep bearing the brunt of each new crisis, widening the gap even further. But also your communities cope and even thrive in their own ways. So clearly there are solutions that exist already. Can each of you give the leaders listening today an example of a solution from your community that needs to be supercharged, and tell them what is missing to scale it up and make it a reality? Hindu first and then Eddie.
In this crisis, I also see hope. I see hope because of the solidarity among nations, among communities, and we all face it together united. We will recover from the COVID only if we think big, better, and look forward, building more equal, sustainable, and healthy planet. We all decide in our local communities, we trust them because they are the one who producing the food, who feeding us. So we need to stop burning fossil fuel because it's linked directly to the environmental protections. Recovery should take form in a Green Deal from the companies to the governments to the local authorities. Our leader must learn the lesson of how we can act all at the same time to fight climate change, which is already here, but to also combat the loss of biodiversity because our life and health depend from the environment where we are living. And that is what we are doing with our communities. But of course, 5 years from now to 2015, the SDGs are more needed than ever. And we all know the Paris Agreement and SDGs was launched to protect peoples and planet, but action are missing. So we need a concrete action now from all the head of state, head of government, in order to take us out from COVID and protect us from the environmental crisis.
Eddie, go ahead.
I want to echo what my sister Hindu has just spoken about, the need for big ideas. And I would go further and say, we need an intersectional approach to policymaking, because what I have witnessed in my capacity as an SDG advocate is that policymakers tend to view these issues in very compartmentalized ways. So we think about these 17 SDGs as separate from one another, when in fact they are indivisible. And so we need to, the people who are disabled are also people who are indigenous. These are also women, because we embody a multiplicity of experiences simultaneously, yet we don't do public policy in a way that is truly intersectional. So I think we need to reimagine the public policy landscape in order to meaningfully address the SDGs in its entirety as an agenda. These are not individual goals that are just glued together and put on a page. These are goals that represent a particular vision of the planet that we want, which is a vision of the planet that is sustainable and that is truly equitable. So I think the ball is in the court of policymakers to really get with the program and start thinking about policy in a deeper, expansive, and intersectional manner.
Well said, both of you, and we do hope that all the leaders here today and watching listen to those words closely and take some inspiration. We'll make a link available so you can watch it back and take some good notes. We just have a few more seconds, so for each of you, what is the one message on the SDGs that you would like viewers today to take away? Hindu?
SDGs are a response to build society that are more resilient. COVID and pandemic are connected to the state of biodiversity. When we damage the earth, we damage our own health. When we protect nature, we protect our health, and indigenous peoples are champions for protecting nature.
Eddie, 15 seconds.
The SDGs are about dignity, about self-actualization. And so when we advance the SDGs, we are advancing the discourse on social justice. This is a moment of global reckoning. It's a sobering time for world leaders to recognize that the SDGs are about people and about planet. It's personal.
Thank you to you both, Hindu Ibrahim and Eddie Ndopou.
Thank you.